Hello. I'm going to read you a story that's about one family's journey with their mother who has probable dementia. This story is derived from a lot of our research where we've spoken with families in particular who've told us many sad stories and many examples of the challenge posed by the slow onset of dementia and the difficulty in actually understanding what might be going on. So here's Katerina's story. Katerina is my mother. She is 85 years old. She migrated from Italy to Australia with her husband Giuseppe in 1950 following the Second World War as part of the post-war immigration of the period. She was a new bride of 22, and over the next 10 years she gave birth to 5 children, me, Anna, and my 2 brothers and sisters. My parents were determined that we would live successful lives in Australia, and they worked hard to ensure that we received a good education. Mum was always cooking and cleaning for her big family. The house always smelt of baking, so warm and welcoming. Dad was a bricklayer and worked in the building trade until he retired in 1993. My sisters and I all became school teachers, while my brothers did their apprenticeships and set up a thriving mechanics business together. My parents were very proud of us all. We had a great childhood and we always knew how important we were. Mum and Dad lived happily in retirement, looking after their veggie patch, visiting their children and grandchildren, going to the local Italian club, and even travelling home to Sicily in 1995, a much-loved journey. Dad was the family patriarch. Mum was content to live in his shadow, especially in their later years together. She always smiled and deferred to him. They were a model couple. Sadly, my father died suddenly of a heart attack in November 2011 at the age of 83. Mum seemed to age 10 years overnight. In keeping with tradition, she took to wearing all black: skirt, cardigan, stockings, shoes. Her face seemed to lose its animation, and she spent many hours visiting Dad's grave. Her main social outlet was with other similarly black-clad immigrant widows. They would meet at the social club on Tuesday afternoons for coffee and cake. Her other major activity was to attend our local Catholic church, where she and her friends met every Sunday for Mass and prayers. Please don't misunderstand. Family was still very important to her, and she would happily sit and watch our children play at our family gatherings. But things did change for all of us after Dad died. A light had gone out in our family group. My brothers and sisters and I held several family meetings in the days after Dad's funeral to discuss Mum's welfare. Could she keep up with the housework, the garden, running the house on her own? Which one of us could take her in? Who had the space, the time? Would she agree to leave her home? We danced around the issue, with no one brave enough to broach things with Mum, until bit by bit it seemed to become less urgent. Sure, the veggie patch was no more, but my brothers kept the garden tidy. Crucifixes and Madonnas had multiplied around the house, but it still seemed clean, and Mum, while quiet, seemed content. We all lived within a 30-minute drive of Mum's house and kept in regular contact with her. The issue of selling the family home and changing Mum's living situation wouldn't be relevant for ages yet, would it? Maybe the question would never come up. A little over 2 months after Dad died, I was paying Mum one of my regular afternoon visits. We were talking a little less about Dad and the old days during my visits. I was hoping to help Mum not dwell on things too much. And we were discussing my daughter and her progress at school, when Mum suddenly asked me if I was still fighting with Vanessa. I got a bit of a fright, as Vanessa was a girl I'd gone to school with many years before, but hadn't seen since those days. I laughed and corrected her that I was talking about my daughter, Maria, her granddaughter. Mum looked almost angry for a moment. Then her face relaxed and she smiled, and she too laughed at her mistake. The rest of the visit went well, and Mum even commented as I was leaving about how mixed up she had become. Looking back, I think that was really the first sign of what was to come. I was talking to Mum's neighbour a couple of weeks later, and she told me that Mum had stopped going out with her friends and that she had noticed Mum occasionally not following the Mass, standing when she should be sitting, and so on. I spoke with my brothers and sisters about how they were finding Mum. My brothers thought she was fine, understandably a little sad, but just the same. But my sister Angela told me that twice when she had gone round, there were dishes unwashed in the sink, something unheard of previously. My brothers were angry that we were talking about this. Peter complained, just because she forgot to wash a dish or got a bit confused about whether you were talking about Maria or your own school days, you're making such a drama. John, my youngest brother, was very frustrated that we were discussing Mum's health at all. When I suggested a visit to the GP, he shouted, "She's fine, can't you see she's fine?" and left the room. The changes were pretty subtle really, lots of little signs that might or might not have meant something. Some days I would be convinced that she was in fact fine, but at other times I'd notice something not quite right. One time her cardigan on inside out. Another time she made tea with spoiled milk. On another occasion she had forgotten to take out the garbage, so I organised for my son to help out with that weekly chore. One afternoon I arrived and Mum was still in her dressing gown, something I had never known her to do before. I asked her if she was feeling sick, and she snapped at me, who did I think I was, and to mind my own business. I didn't know what to say. Her response was so out of character and much more concerning to me than her wearing her night clothes during the day. One day Mum rang Peter because the stove wasn't working. It turned out that the gas had been cut off. Dad had been managing all the finances for some time, it seemed, something Mum had always proudly taken care of when we were kids. Peter continued to make excuses. Mum had just forgotten, she was grieving, she'd gotten out of the habit of paying, she'd let Dad take over to give him something to do. But he did support my taking Mum to see her GP. Angela agreed with me that it was time, and John said it couldn't hurt. Katerina seemed to distance herself from the issue. Angela said it was due to her being the baby. The visit to the GP was okay, but didn't really solve any problems. Mum wasn't against going. I think she thought it unnecessary, but was prepared to humour me. She had been seeing the same doctor for several years, but only rarely visited him. Mum has never been one to spend time worrying about her health. He asked her a few questions about her general health. To hear her reply, you'd think everything was fine. Yes, yes, good, good. She did get the year wrong when quizzed. She said 2011 instead of 2012, but then it was still early in the year. And she stumbled over who was the current Prime Minister, but there had been a few names swirling about lately, and she got everything else pretty much right. Her blood pressure was a little bit high, and so the doctor ordered some blood tests, and we made another appointment for the following week. Her blood results were great. The GP said he wished his were as good when he was her age, but her blood pressure was still up, so he ordered her some medication for that. I was concerned about her ability to take the pills and stayed back to mention this to the doctor, but he said he thought she would be fine with them and to let him know if we had any trouble. He said she wasn't getting any younger and that she had had a recent loss, so we had to expect some changes. We set an appointment for another 2 weeks. Mum decided she wouldn't take the tablets once we got home. She said that doctors worried too much and that she didn't need them. She also said she thought she wouldn't bother with the follow-up visit. I tried persuading her over the next few days, but she wouldn't shift and started getting cranky with me, so I backed off. My brothers and sisters thought she had the right to decide about her own health and that we should wait and see how things went because her blood tests were so good. We didn't have long to wait. A couple of weeks later, we got a call from the cemetery where Dad is buried. Mum had been found wandering around the graves toward dusk, apparently unable to find the exit and the tram stop for home. She was distressed and confused and spoke Italian when the funeral director first approached her. I raced out to get her and found her anxious and teary. She said she'd been looking for Dad and had gotten lost. I took her home with me that night and called the family in for a meeting a couple of days later. I said I was worried she was ill, and in any case I feared she was not safe anymore at home. John was still unhappy with my opinion, but the others agreed. Katerina said she'd been talking to a girl at her work who thought Mum might have dementia. No way, Mum's crazy, said Peter. But we were all thinking about it, you could tell. I was just so worried about her. I couldn't bear to think of her being lost and on her own. Mum moved in with me and my family in June 2012, just 6 months after Dad's death. When we cleared the house, it was obvious that things had gotten away from Mum on many fronts. There were unwashed clothes crammed into the wardrobe, and she'd started to store them in the washing machine as well. She'd just about run out of clean clothes, and her bed linen looked like it hadn't been changed in weeks. She'd also been hiding food in cupboards around the house and had been masking the smells with multiple deodoriser cans that were also in most cupboards. We couldn't believe how many signs we'd missed, but I guess we only saw what we saw. Katerina thinks we should contact the Alzheimer's Association. I think we should go back to Mum's GP. Maybe we need to do both. I'm still working and the kids are at school, so I'm worried about Mum during the day. So far she seems at peace and is pretty calm, but yesterday I did find the toaster in the laundry. I'm frightened about what the future may hold for us all.